Fans of the Horus Heresy, thank you very much for joining me for a how-to video, and this is called Mind the Gap. So it's nothing actually to do with getting on the tube in London. If you've ever been, you'll know what I mean. But what I'm actually going to show you and demo here is how to get a good fit on a resin kit where you've got several components that are going to essentially make a box or something equivalent. And to do that, we're going to use this latest acquisition to my collection, the Coronus Grav-Carrier. Now this is a really good example to use because we've got a hull that's going to be made up of 4 pieces. So we've got the upper hull, 2 sides, left and right, and then a floor. In addition, we've got a hinged hatch that is going to attach to the rear. So that means we've got to think about a correct alignment for that to work. And then we've got the side booms. Now the side booms aren't going to feature too much in this, but they'll come into play later. So there's going to be I'm going to film a series of sequences on this, edit them all together, and you'll be able to see how I'm going to show you how I go about figuring out how to get these parts aligned where they don't fit. So the first stage is I'm going to dry fit the components of the hull together. So not using the booms, but the other 5 who will. Right, so let's go to that then. Okay, so here we have it. The hull is now dry fit together. So hopefully I'm not going to cause it to spring apart because this is not as secure as it looks. Right, so it's dry fitted. So what we want to do now is look to see how the fit looks. So let's look at the sides first. So immediately something is apparent. There's an apparent misalignment here, and we can see that there is a clear gap on this top leading edge here, and perhaps a gap at the front. And if we rotate the Coronus round to the other side, we can see a similar void or a similar separation on the opposite side of the hull as well. So we know this. I know there's something there that needs to be corrected. Let's now look at the underside of the Coronus. So on the right hand side, as we're looking at it, so this side, there's actually a nice close fit between the hull floor and that side of the hull. However, on this side of the hull, we can see that there's a gap here. Now, as the shape of a hull floor looks pretty good and there's no big mould slips on it or anything, I think we've got a bit of there's a bit of work, a bit of reshaping that needs to be done on this side of the hull to close that gap. Now, you can, I mean, as you can see there, you can push fit it, but if you do that, if you glue it in that position, that part is going to be permanently under stress, and it just weakens the model. And also, you never know, at some point in the future, adhesive may fail, being subjected to that stress over time. So that's another thing we need to be aware of. Looking at the front here, that looks pretty good. I think once we approach the final stage of this, there might be a little bit of work required just to align that. But that looks quite good. And you can, I'm working with the assumption that this is going to be a smooth, flat surface across here and here. Okay, so where else might we want to look for alignment? So the next thing to consider is alignment down the side of the hull. And by this I mean, do we get a smooth fit across this ridge and the hull roof? So here, that is nice and that's fairly smooth, and with a little bit of work I'll get it there. Here it's a bit less so. And if we look at that, we can see actually that this piece here seems to pinch in a bit. So that to me says that although this fits fine, this is too narrow. And if we take our the side of the Coronus and attach it there, we can see we're going to get some sort of gap there. So there's some work that needs to be done to correct that. Now, given that we need to kind of like, there's a trade-off here, because do we sacrifice a good join here, or do we sacrifice a good join here? Well, I'm more inclined to sacrifice a bit here, because this is a structural join on this side, and these are obviously, this is a big heavy part, and that's going to bear a lot of weight. So that's another part we're going to look at. On this side of the vehicle, if we look at that, we've got quite a lot of that's actually a bit low. This hull is sitting a bit low all the way along, and again it pinches in at the front. If we look at the rear, one of the challenges with large resin box assemblies is figuring out what the correct alignment is, but the kit designers have actually, or the sculptor probably, because I actually do the kit design, they have actually helped us out here with these two notches. If we flip this open, these notches here are telling us what the alignment should be like, so it should probably be something like that. So we're going to get a gap though, which is going to need to be filled. We also need to make sure that this door is going to close properly as well, so that needs to be accounted for. So straight off there, you can, before you do anything in terms of heat bending a model or sanding extra bits off, you want to take the keys away, remove any significant bits of detritus and flash, and then do a dry fit, and just, as I say, put it together as I've done here, and just study how everything fits together. You know, check things like, is the top of the hull, is it straight? So let's do that here. Is it straight? Well, be careful not to get any barrel distortion off the camera. It looks fairly straight. What actually could be the case is this might need bending up. So yeah, always consider the possibility that any part could be wrong, even if intuitively your eye seems to draw you towards one part. Always consider the possibility that the other part involved in the join is wrong. And so we need some sort of way of trying to figure out here which is the right part to bend. Is it the upper hull or is it these? So, I mean, with the upper hull, it's hard to tell because there's very little in the way of, you know, it's highly curved. I mean, looking at these joints here, these seem to be fairly perpendicular. So they intuitively look fairly good to me. So I think let's look at these lower side hull pieces to see if we can check if they're true. I'm just wondering how we could do that. I mean, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check this the line of this lower hull from here to here. I'm going to use a ruler to do that, straight edge. Okay, that's interesting, that isn't. So I can set this up right. It's going to be quite difficult. And that's actually, right, okay, we'll do it on here. Right, if I hold that there, I can actually see a gap. So that doesn't appear to me to be quite straight, and it looks like that is supposed to be straight, and you know, this corresponding hull piece here that's a straight fit. So let's check the other side as well. This might be a bit hard for you guys to see. Do it that way around. Yeah, I think we've got the same thing there as well. Oh, there we go, that shows it more clearly there. So I've put them edge to edge. You can see there's a clear gap down the middle because they're slightly concave on each side. So what I'm actually thinking now is this needs to bend up ever so slightly to fill that gap, as opposed to this bending down. So I'm going to go do that. That's kind of helpful because I can also bend these out slightly at the same time, so I can hopefully resolve a couple of issues there by bending two parts. Let's see what happens. Right then, so here we are. I just spent slightly under an hour and a half working on the parts, doing some heat bending to try get rid of those gaps, and it was quite a challenging one, this. Perhaps one of the more challenging models I've dealt with, perhaps one of the most challenging models I've dealt with. So let me show where we got to. So let's start with the good side. So you can see here I've got a reasonable alignment, so you can see how this, you know, you want to think about what the visible detail is. Well, this underside is going to show, particularly when you pick it up. and it's got to line up here at the back. So when I make sure that these rear edges are aligned, like so, that's got to carry all the way through. And we can see more or less we've got that. There's going to be some filling and smoothing required, but more or less that fits. Okay. If we now turn it around to the other side, you can see we have an enormous gap, and actually this part is, in my view, this is actually a little bit too small for the hull, and it certainly is a bit smaller than this part. And let me explain my reasoning for that. So again, this part has got to align correctly at the rear. You know, there is a clear line that has to be followed there to make up the shape of the door, and that has to line up. So I've created that alignment correctly, and I've used the shape of the door to get that right. And when we carry that through to the front, we've got this gap here, and that gap is a little bit over 1 millimetre in length. But of course, you know, perhaps saying it's 1 millimetre big doesn't really tell the true story. I mean, it's a huge gap, isn't it? So, and there's a bit of a weakness there, because if you correct that there, if I bent that to fit properly correct there, then the lower level doesn't align properly. So what I'm going to do to cope with this flaw, I mean, to be honest, I could ask Forgel to replace this part because it doesn't fit properly. However, I do want to press on with this kit and get it built. So what I'm going to do instead on this occasion, so I've got lots of spare resin here. I'm going to build up a space at the front of that to basically help me with the fitting, so I'm not sort of like wobbling around when I come to glue this. So the next thing is obviously to glue this together, and then there's an absolute shed load of filling and sanding to do to get it all true. But I'm going to build that up, and then I'll smooth it all in as I work on it. And I've decided on this one, the fit isn't particularly good on the rear doors either. I'm not overly happy with how well that lines up there. And also the bulkhead, which goes at the end of here, is too small, so that wobbles around. There's like 1 millimetre play on that. So that's a shame, because that stops it serving any structural purpose. So I'm going to leave that out actually, and then I've got a spare part. And here we are. So I've done some further work to deal with the gaps, the sort of the forward to back gaps on those side hull pieces in relation to the upper hull. So let's take these booms off and I'll show you what I've done. So if we remember the right hand side of the vehicle, that had a particularly large gap, didn't it? So what I've done is I've put a piece of spare resin in here, and I've basically cut it to shape and sanded it down, and that's now acting as a spacer there, to give a tight fit there. And when I say tight fit, I'm not looking for a tight fit in terms of the upper part. I mean, I'm not really bothered about that because that's going to be hidden by the boom. But what I do want to get smooth even are these areas down here, which are going to be forming part of the external detail. And by the time I've glued this and got it sort of fixed in the correct position, that will achieve that. I've done the same thing on the other side, a bit less drastic. And then but then what I found from doing that is I then had a gap here, so I've stuck a piece of resin onto the front, and I'll show you that in a second once I just showed you the rear. So now I've got decent alignment on the rear hull section as well, or certainly by the time I stick it in position with adhesive it will. And let me show you now, let me take the hull apart and I'll show you what I did at the front. So you can see there's a extra piece of resin here. This is an offcut. I think it was actually it's a thin flat piece from, I believe it was actually from the hull of my Glaive heavy tank that I'd seen at the time when I made it a few years ago and kept it, so I thought it might be beautiful, and sure enough it's come in handy. So yeah, so I stuck it on, then I've just cut it to shape once it was stuck, and that's just acting as a filler at the front there. So once this is stuck together, there's still going to be a whole host of filling to do, and there's still quite a lot more cleaning up work to do on various bits. I mean, particularly the particularly the rear here. There's some big keys to deal with. I mean, if you remember my unboxing video, I said there might have been some slippage or something here, and I think that's indeed the case. So I'm going to have to kind of like build these areas up here, so these sensor assemblies fit correctly. So that's going to require some work as well. But yeah. So I hope you found that interesting. How to deal with, mind the gap. How to deal with gaps when you're putting large resin hulled vehicles together, and some of the challenges that you may encounter and how you might look to overcome those. Thank you very much for watching. I'll speak to you next time, and goodbye.